It is the question that literally hundreds of thousands of you have asked for the first time in just the last 10 days. Can the sun really micronova? Perhaps your question was merely, what is a micronova? It's not a supernova, it's not even really a nova, as it is like the little sister of the nova, one that can affect the entire world, but not completely destroy it. In this way, it offers the one thing that all impactor hypotheses cannot, a way for the cycle to happen again and again and again. And it turns out that the sun satisfies the impactor hypothesis as well, and potentially been a bit more beneath our noses than we realized. Now let's begin with the what. What would this type of event be? Well, variable stars are already well known, mostly changing in photon emission and luminosity, but with noticeable effects often seen rippling out in succession. But there are also the repeating particle blasters, the 10 known recurrent nova of the Milky Way. These are exactly what they sound like. Astronomers have witnessed multiple nova from the same star. Not supernova, which destroy what was there, but a smaller nova, still tremendously powerful, such that an Earth around it would have been obliterated. But alas, in that sweet spot where the star can boom again, and in some cases again and again and again. Now, in all of these cases, it is thought that a sun-like star has a close orbiting binary, much smaller than it, which feeds material down, accumulating in the atmosphere of it and triggering an explosive shell release. It is notable that while some or all may be binaries, none of the purported binary stars have ever been imaged at those regions, and in fact, solitary stars will encounter dust and gas and asteroids and comets and accumulate the same material over time. The single most important thing to know right now is there is almost no serious astronomer alive who would claim this list is complete. They fully expect to see some of the nova they have cataloged in the last century show up once again and make this list, and way more importantly, they know there are almost certainly those with extremely long cycle times that we have not even seen go boom once in the time of astronomical science, which really only goes back about 100 years for these types of events, and which could completely miss a cycle of hundreds or thousands of years, even if it's right in our backyard. This evidence of seemingly impossible and unimaginable scenarios on our star is complex, but unnerving in how convincing it can be. There is no shortcut here, so let's begin with our 2014 interview with Robert Schoch, the famous Yale-trained geologist and a professor at Boston for 30 years, who takes us from Egypt to a solar disaster unlike anything we've ever seen. We are here with Robert Schoch.
The traditional Egyptologists consider the Great Sphinx 2500 BC, to date from 2500 BC approximately, and weathering on the body of the Sphinx in particular did not match the 2500 BC date. What I mean by that is that the body of the Sphinx is carved down into the bedrock. Only the head stands above the general level of the plateau, and I'll say now the head is recarved, so it's not the original head on the Great Sphinx. The body is what you have to look at, and the walls of what are known as the Sphinx enclosure, these are heavily weathered by rain. You can see that in the way the layers have sort of what I call rolling or undulating profile. They have deep vertical fissures. So this suggested to me almost immediately on my first trip that there was something amiss here, that there was something earlier than the Great Sphinx as we see it now with a human head and a lion body, and that in fact, based on the level of weathering, based on the climatic regime, had to go back at least a few thousand years. The Egyptologists in particular, they were livid. They were absolutely livid. The archaeologists were livid. They told me that this was absolutely impossible. They said that civilization didn't go back that far. Civilization only went back about 5, maybe 6,000 years at the most. People were hunter-gatherers. They couldn't build stone sculptures. They couldn't build monumental structures, that I must be crazy, that I was a pseudoscientist. I mean, they were really calling me nasty names. I'm now happy pushing the origins of the Sphinx back to even 10,000 or so BC, the very end of the last ice age. And This ties in also with what I believe was happening at the end of the last ice age, which included torrential rains, very different climate than we have now. And I believe that the evidence we have is indicating that we had civilization, what I call high civilization, back at the end of the last ice age, all of which was devastated by major solar outbursts, what I call earlier cycle of civilization. The best dating, I'm convinced, is about 9700 BC. At that point, it suddenly gets incredibly warm, very, very warm, and based on ice cores in particular from Greenland, also looking at various sediment cores and other data, including even some lunar data that was collected. We have a very sudden warming snap just about 9700 BC at the best calibration. And this happened so quickly that based on ice cores, it was within 1 to 3 years. The thing is, we can't resolve it any better than that. It could have literally been within a couple of weeks or even overnight, which is essentially off the scale, if you would. And when you look at isotope data for solar activity and various proxies for solar activity that you find, again, sediment cores and ice cores, I believe what we had at 9700 BC is an incredible solar outburst, the Carrington event by orders of magnitude greater. This is based on isotope evidence from Greenland ice cores. Shows that the sun was very active, very unstable at that time, underwent these major solar outbursts, and this would have the effect of warming the climate dramatically, virtually overnight, virtually instantaneously. This is something that was predicted by Thomas Gold, or hypothesized by Thomas Gold, as early as the 1960s. He was an award-winning astronomer at Cornell University, but people say, oh, you've gone off the deep end when you're talking about something like that happening. But he, as other astrophysicists have pointed out, our sun is a star. It's not the same all the time geologically, if I could put it that way. But I wanted to mention, too, that there's other evidence for this. When you start looking at the archaeological record, I believe that a lot of things fall into place when you start thinking in terms of a major solar outburst bringing down these early civilizations, these what I'll call late Ice Age civilizations. I do want to mention, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with Anthony Perrott and his work, Dr. Perrott, and his the plasma physicist. And he has done, of course, a lot of work looking at petroglyphs in particular, ancient petroglyphs, and has independent from my work, hypothesized or suggested that these ancient petroglyphs are drawings, effectively, of plasma configurations in the sky during a major solar outburst in antiquity, as he calls it, deep antiquity. I believe this corresponds with the solar outburst I'm talking about. Vitrification is something that has been found in the archaeological record, which is very mysterious in the sense of how do you explain it? What it is surface melting and recongealing, I'll call it that way, refreezing of rock surfaces. This is known throughout parts of Europe and getting into Turkey and Syria. This gets back to something that Thomas Gould was talking about and hypothesized in the 60s, that during a major solar outburst, you would have in certain areas, sort of like a tornado, not everywhere, but certain areas, huge, we could think of as huge thunderbolts or lightning bolts actually hitting the surface. And I believe we found it. You also find that in parts of the Sahara, for instance. Most people probably are familiar with one thing from Plato, if they know anything about Plato, and that is the story of Atlantis. He is very clear about the chronology. And when you turn that into our modern chronology, he basically dates the fall of Atlantis. He dates it to about 9600 BC, which to me it's probably beyond coincidental that this, in fact, is the modern dating of the end of the last ice age.
This is an animation inside one of those variable stars I mentioned. Essentially, the concept of variable stellar activity is not a new one, just think about the sunspot cycle. But here we require the extending of the scales to the extremes, and luckily just requiring so at the extremes of a long cycle. Let's begin this examination with the wildest claim made so far today, that a solar micronova could actually act like the impactor scenario and give us all that evidence like a comet or asteroid impact would. We heard a little bit of this from Robert Schoch, and we'll hit this once now and again in the remaining evidence. But first, it is thought that nearly the whole sun's shell is blasted outward, ending up making a solar system that looks like this. But forget the model, because we now have the best imaged recurring nova, and it's what they think they would see if they could see them all this well. This rapidly cycling nova has produced a debris field of densely compacted blobs spread over an area 1 light year across. These are the remnants of not only 6 such recurring nova at this star, the ones we've seen, but all of the ones that came before. NASA describes it as a shotgun blast debris. They expect there to be pieces the size of megaplanets to the size of dust, which is why the fully realized debris field looks like this. According to the evidence, any planets in orbit would have been blasted like a shotgun of heavy material, the heavier elements too, like carbon, iron, lithium, and more. Let's go next to the fact that cycles appear to be the name of the game. The cyclical nature presents problems for one-time events like an impactor. Yes, we could be entering a stream of impactors every 12,000 years, but is that more likely to produce that narrow sweet spot of global disaster but not total annihilation? Or does a solar clock cycle make more sense for something that needs to be repeatable? I want to look at Douglas Vogt right now because not only does he prefer the cycle like many other great researchers in the field, but also because he, like Schoch, and like many of our ancestors, like the sun as the culprit. And nobody has ever put that version of this story together like he has. His name should be with Velikovsky, Hapgood, and others, if not above them. His books are ungodly more cited than the selectivity I will agree was needed for his free YouTube videos, but you don't need the hundreds of citations in those books to get the picture. He communicates it well. The cycle of 12,000 years is evident at least 6 times in the organic material carbon dating. 12,000, 24,000, 36,000, 48,000, 60,000, and 72,000 years ago, which implicates slow geological crawl, punctuated by horrific extinction every 12,000 years. But these cycles can also be found in non-glacial evidence in the rock strata and in the volcanic outflows as well. He describes what many others have described, the surprise findings of glacial carvings on now equatorial lands from just the last few cycles. And we know the whole Earth didn't get that cold, so those areas weren't at the equator when it happened. Now, while he gives you tons of citations, and I know there are some of you who geek out on that, I want to go another direction with this specific line of evidence. I can tell you as the grandson of 2 veterans of foreign wars that the stories passed down in that realm are not like Santa or bedtime stories. You know they are real because grandma and mom are often scolding grandpa, and grandpa is responding that they need to hear this or they need to know how it really was, and you can see it in their faces, even as a child. This, I'm sure, was the case with young Ken White, as his father, Major Maynard E. White, commander of Project Nanook, told him stories of the first men to battle the North Pole by air. The stories are the basis for his book, World in Peril. After about 100 pages of everything there is to know about just how much it stinks to be stuck up in the Arctic flying airplanes and how scary the Soviet threat was at the time, not to mention negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you get an almost out-of-place 4 chapters sandwiched in the middle of the book that have almost nothing to do with what comes before or after, except it was Major White's squadron that did it, and which really test your belief in the stories passed down from soldier to child. At least that would be the case if not for all the corroborating evidence. The following parts that are not from known science works are direct communications from Major White to his son, Ken, mostly about the secret meetings at the Pentagon. It is up to us to decide for ourselves if we believe the son's testimony. After laying out how they were presented the various lines of evidence for catastrophe that punctuates the slow crawl of geology, from preserved trees at high latitude that must have lived their lives at the equator, The same can be found in Antarctica, along with a coal seam that must have come from an enormous forest continent, and of course, the dead animals, the boneyards. And then the conclusions found at the site, and then after consideration at the Pentagon. They initially believed they had actually found evidence of 9 cycles of catastrophe. One important note was the recognition of what may have happened to science since the late 1940s, which is the confusion caused by the movement and contamination of the rocks used to date and navigate the ancient world from millennia in the future. Interesting to see that what proponents of catastrophe said had happened was expressly mentioned as a possibility for scientists at the Pentagon. More on that in a moment. The Major quickly learned that this was not strictly a military operation. The Rand Corporation's involvement became predominant almost immediately at the Pentagon, and they performed thousands of experiments with the same thing happening every time. The North Pole would slowly meander around the Arctic Circle and then begin to trace towards the pole, speeding up, faster, and then catch a hairpin turn around the geographic pole and come back down. This is crucial because they say the mantle and core have never ever shifted their rotational axis. It is just the thin crust that can be torqued. And this is due to the magnetization of the crust, which is full of metal, crystal, and polar molecules known as water, which will seek to take that bent horseshoe-like magnet and straighten it out through a crustal displacement. Their analysis revealed 4 of the 9 layers to be doubles, and the Pentagon confidently nailed down 5 cycles of catastrophe. They fell 12,000 years apart. Now, adding to the possible confusion that geologists faced, we mentioned it a few minutes ago, the discussions at the Pentagon on whether to tell the public really illuminate how the process eventually became a highly controlled, limited hangout aimed at testing the waters of the public. As we saw in Part 1, this is really how they decided on secrecy and potentially drove the public version of the story from Hapgood in a direction that could be easily debunked. Don't forget, he came from the CIA first. Now, while they pegged the crust displacement to a magnetic pole flip in the late 40s, they never took it any further, and it would be a decade until the sun scared them in the late 50s, and NASA was created 3 months later. This is where Vogt comes in, and the others today and in the past who have pointed to the sun. Major White did not have that tool in the toolbox, neither did the Pentagon or the stories they had to tell his son. There are 2 lines of evidence here that are critical: the mystery of the sun and the evidence of its recurring micronova. Why does the sun have an 11-year cycle of sunspot and solar flare activity, and an 88-year Gliesberg cycle? Well, their best guesses have produced what's known as the dynamo model, but advanced viewers of this channel know that even parts of this are a somehow the sun does it explanation. In truth, it is fairly difficult to understand how a thermonuclear engine at the core results in those cycles, especially when the greater grand cycle of activity projects even longer timelines. Our work on the sun and earthquakes indicates their magnetic fields can affect terrestrial seismicity, and that is difficult to reconcile with this nuclear engine driving it all. And perhaps the most interesting is the near-perfect sphere shape, the most perfect sphere in the known cosmos, which seems impossible due to the same forces that bulge out every other known sphere in the cosmos. These things implicate that the sun might be some sort of clock, that it has a deep electromagnetic connection to the planet Earth, and that it is not following the rules of science we would traditionally prescribe to it. If the sun is on a 12,000-year micronova cycle, there would be no modern observations. But our ancestors would have had to do something crazy like claim the sun was responsible for disaster. Wink. Vogt is the only person I have ever heard discuss the dark periods and light travel time to Earth in the stellar records, and the only one I've ever heard look at naturally produced glass beads on the moon with fission tracks and recognize that the scientists were saying something without saying it publicly in the journals. It was this revelation that these came from the micronova. They are the exploded shell, combined with the shotgun blast we see at other recurring micronova systems, leads one to believe that at one time, or maybe many times in the cycle, including at the end of the Younger Dryas, a larger chunk of the blasted micronova shell hit the Earth as an impactor. It would not even have to do so, since its energetic state would produce arc discharges that can only create craters with high iron content at the base due to the magnetic aspect of the event. If it discharges, the impactor theory is satisfied. These recreations of craters and burn scars are from the Yelverton Plasma Laboratory, In the next episode, we'll have Douglas Vogt here to describe the evidence and finer detail of the solar micronova scenario, including why he thinks Earth has less than 3 decades left until the next one. Eyes open, no fear. Be safe, everyone.